The sky has always been a mystery, but in the tense years of the Cold War, it became a battlefield of dreams. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin shocked the world by becoming the first human to orbit Earth. Just 8 years later, Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon, and humanity itself crossed a frontier that had once seemed impossible. This is the story of how one orbit led to one step, and how the space race forever changed our place in the universe. Asterisk, if you enjoy calm but fascinating history, don't forget to like this video and subscribe now. Let's begin. The story of humanity's first steps into space did not begin with rockets, nor with astronauts in gleaming suits, but with a world fractured by tension. At the end of the Second World War, Earth itself seemed divided into two camps, two visions of the future that stood in stark opposition. On one side was the United States, powerful, wealthy, and proud of its democratic ideals. On the other stood the Soviet Union, scarred by war, yet unyielding, determined to prove that its system, its ideology, and its strength could not only survive, but triumph. Between them stretched the vast shadow of the Cold War, a struggle fought, not only with armies and weapons, but with symbols, prestige, and the battle for human imagination. The race to space would grow from this soil, shaped by mistrust and ambition. And before a man ever touched the stars, Earth itself had to be drawn into rivalry. The Cold War was unlike any conflict before it. There was no single battlefield where soldiers clashed, no decisive invasion that could end it in a day. Instead, it was a conflict of ideas and of influence, fought through propaganda, alliances, and demonstrations of power. Each side sought to prove that its system was superior not only militarily but culturally, scientifically, and morally. When the United States detonated the atomic bombs in 1945, it seemed to many that America had entered an era of dominance. Yet the Soviet Union soon matched and then surpassed expectations, testing its own nuclear device in 1949. The world entered a dangerous balance, where both sides held weapons powerful enough to destroy civilization. In such a climate, every achievement mattered, every demonstration of power carried meaning far beyond its practical use. To launch a satellite, to send a man beyond Earth, would be more than science. It would be victory in a struggle for the soul of the 20th century. The seeds of the space race were planted in Germany during the war. The Nazi regime had developed the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile, under the direction of Wernher von Braun. These terrifying weapons rained destruction on London and other cities, but their legacy lay less in their impact and more in their technology. When the war ended, both the United States and the Soviet Union scrambled to capture German scientists and their designs. Operation Paperclip in America brought von Braun and his team to the United States, while the Soviets secured other engineers and equipment. Thus, the very men who had once built rockets for Hitler would soon build rockets for rival superpowers, their knowledge becoming the foundation of humanity's journey into space. The early years after the war were marked by suspicion and competition. In Europe, the Iron Curtain descended, dividing East from West. In Asia, new conflicts erupted in Korea, deepening the sense of global struggle. In America, fear of communism spread, while in the Soviet Union, the memory of invasion fueled determination. never to fall behind again. Into this atmosphere of tension entered the idea of space. For centuries, space had been the realm of dreamers and visionaries, of science fiction writers and philosophers. But by the mid-20th century, it became a stage for real rivalry. If one nation could place a satellite into orbit, if one nation could send a man beyond Earth, it would prove not only scientific superiority, but ideological triumph. The space race was born not in peace, but in competition, a reflection of a world divided. In 1957, the Soviet Union stunned the world with the launch of Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. A polished sphere no larger than a beach ball, Sputnik orbited Earth every 96 minutes, beeping its simple radio signal for all to hear. For scientists, it was a marvel, proof that rockets could reach orbit. For ordinary people, it was both wonder and fear. In America, citizens looked up at the night sky and realized that a Soviet satellite passed overhead, visible to the naked eye. Newspapers cried out about a missile gap, politicians demanded action, and schools redoubled their focus on science and mathematics. The Soviets had claimed the first great victory of the space race, and the United States, proud of its technological might, found itself humbled. Behind Sputnik stood the personality of Sergei Korolev, the brilliant and secretive chief designer of the Soviet space program. Though his name was kept hidden at the time, his leadership pushed the USSR into the lead. He had endured imprisonment under Stalin, yet emerged determined to push his nation into the heavens. Under his guidance, Sputnik was followed by greater triumphs. Sputnik 2 carried the first living creature, the dog Laika, into orbit later that same year. For the Soviet Union, these achievements were more than science, they were propaganda. Victories, demonstrations to the world that communism could outpace capitalism. For America, they were wake-up calls, jolts that sparked a massive effort to catch up. The American response came with the creation of NASA in 1958. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration was charged not only with scientific exploration, but with restoring national pride. Rockets like Atlas and Redstone began to take shape. Astronauts were recruited and trained, and the goal became clear. The United States would not allow the Soviet Union to dominate the skies. Yet in those early years, the gap remained. American. Rockets exploded on launch pads, satellites failed to reach orbit, and the Soviets seemed always a step ahead. It was in this context that Yuri Gagarin prepared for his flight. The world he would leave behind on April 12, 1961, was a world deeply divided, its people fearful of war, yet also hopeful for progress. Gagarin's orbit was not only a scientific triumph, but a symbol of Soviet strength, a victory in the Cold War fought not with guns, but with dreams. For Americans, his flight was a challenge, a reminder that the world stage had shifted to space, and that the next great battles of prestige would be fought above the Earth. For the Soviets, it was proof that their system could achieve greatness. For humanity, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one in which our species began to slip the bonds of Earth. Before the race to the moon, before Armstrong's step, the world had to be shaped by this rivalry. The Cold War provided the tension, the urgency, the resources, and the fear that drove nations to do the impossible. It was a time when rockets meant weapons, when satellites meant spies, and when every achievement in space was also a message to rivals on Earth. Yet it was also a time when human imagination soared, when the dream of spaceflight leapt from science fiction into reality. And so, the space race began not in unity, not in peace, but in division. A world split by ideology found itself united in only one thing: the belief that space was a new frontier, and that to reach it first was to prove superiority. From this divided world emerged the drama that would carry Gagarin into orbit and Armstrong onto the moon, a drama fueled by rivalry but destined to change humanity forever. Long before rockets roared skyward and astronauts strapped themselves into capsules, the dream of spaceflight lived in the human imagination. For centuries, men and women gazed at the night sky and wondered if those distant lights could ever be reached. Poets, philosophers, and storytellers spoke of journeys to the moon and beyond, long before the technology existed to make such voyages real. The dream of leaving Earth is as old as civilization itself, but it would take a combination of science, determination, and visionaries willing to defy the limits of their age to transform that dream into reality. Before Yuri Gagarin's orbit and Neil Armstrong's step, there were centuries of yearning, centuries of thought, and a slow accumulation of knowledge that paved the way. The earliest visions of space travel were fantasies, but they mattered, because they kept the idea alive. Ancient myths told of gods and heroes flying through the heavens. In the 2nd century, the writer Lucian of Samosata imagined a journey to the moon in one of the first works of science fiction. Later, during the Renaissance, writers like Johannes Kepler and Cyrano de Bergerac speculated about voyages beyond Earth. Their ideas were fanciful, involving flocks of birds carrying men upward or strange machines powered by imagination. But behind the whimsy was a seed, the belief that the heavens might one day be reached by human effort. These stories kept alive the notion that the sky was not an unreachable ceiling, but a frontier waiting to be crossed. The real path to space began with science. In the 17th century, Isaac Newton described the laws of motion and gravity, showing that the same force pulling an apple to the ground also held the moon in orbit. With this revelation, space became less mystical and more mathematical. Newton even imagined a cannon so powerful that it could fire a projectile fast enough to circle Earth rather than fall back to the surface, an idea that foreshadowed the principle of orbit. Though no cannon of his age could achieve such velocity, the concept revealed that leaving Earth was not magic, but mechanics. From that point forward, reaching the heavens became a question not of myth, but of technology. In the 19th century, the dream gathered new strength. Science fiction gained popularity with works like Jules Verne's From the Earth to the Moon, which depicted a voyage launched by a massive cannon. Verne's tale was fanciful, but it inspired readers and future engineers by framing space travel as a technical challenge rather than pure fantasy. Around the same time, advances in chemistry and physics began to hint at real possibilities. Experiments with explosives, fuels, and propulsion suggested that flight beyond the atmosphere might one day be achievable. What had once been the stuff of dreams was slowly becoming the subject of serious study. The true pioneers of modern rocketry were thinkers who devoted their lives to turning vision into method. One of the earliest was Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, a Russian school teacher who, in the late 19th century, developed the mathematics of rocketry. He was not an engineer. He never built a rocket himself, but in notebooks and papers he worked out the equations that would guide generations of rocket builders. Tsiolkovsky showed that to reach space, rockets would need to use liquid fuel and operate in stages, shedding weight as they climbed. He famously wrote that Earth is the cradle of humanity, but one cannot live in the cradle forever. For him, spaceflight was not just possible, but inevitable, the next step in humanity's evolution. Though he lived in obscurity for much of his life, his equations would become the foundation of the Soviet space program decades later. Across the world, others followed similar paths. In the United States, Robert Goddard quietly experimented with rockets in the early 20th century. He built and launched the first liquid-fueled rocket in 1926, a slender machine that rose only modestly into the sky but marked a turning point. Goddard endured skepticism and even ridicule from the press, which dismissed his ideas of reaching the moon as fanciful. Yet he persisted, refining his designs, testing new fuels, and dreaming of interplanetary travel. Though he died before the space race began, his work laid critical groundwork for the rockets that would one day carry men into orbit. In Germany, Hermann Oberth and his students turned rocketry into a movement. Oberth's book, The Rocket into Planetary Space, published in 1923, inspired a generation of young engineers, including a boy named Werner von Braun. Rocket societies formed. Enthusiasts launched experimental designs, and what had once been the domain of dreamers became the passion of scientists and engineers. By the 1930s, governments began to notice, especially as rockets showed potential as weapons. The dream of space was merging with the realities of military power, a fusion that would define the 20th century. World War II accelerated rocket development in ways both tragic and transformative. In Germany, von Braun's team created the V-2, a weapon that became the world's first long-range ballistic missile. Though built for destruction, the V-2 demonstrated that rockets could reach the edge of space. It soared higher and faster than any machine before it, proving that Tsiolkovsky's equations were not only theory but practice. After the war, both the United States and the Soviet Union sought to capture German rocket technology and expertise. Scientists who had once built weapons for the Nazis were now tasked with building rockets for new superpowers. The dream of spaceflight, born of imagination and nurtured by science, had been carried into reality by the machinery of war. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, the dream of spaceflight was no longer confined to individuals. Nations began to see space as the next frontier of power and prestige. The Soviet Union, guided by Korolev, embraced Tsiolkovsky's vision and poured resources into rocket development. The United States, with von Braun and other German scientists, pursued its own path, blending military objectives with scientific exploration. Both nations were driven by rivalry, but beneath the competition lay the shared inheritance of centuries of dreaming. Each rocket that climbed into the sky carried not only fuel and metal, but the weight of human imagination stretching back to ancient myths. For the ordinary person in the mid-20th century, the dream of space was both thrilling and terrifying. Science fiction stories filled magazines, films depicted voyages to Mars, and children looked at the stars with new hope. Yet behind the wonder was fear, for the same rockets that could carry men to the moon could also deliver warheads across continents. Spaceflight was bound up with the Cold War, and the dream was shadowed by the threat of nuclear destruction. Humanity stood on the threshold of the stars, yet also on the edge of catastrophe. And still, the dream endured. When Yuri Gagarin climbed into his Vostok capsule in 1961, he carried more than the ambitions of the Soviet Union. He carried the centuries-old vision of humanity leaving its cradle. When Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon 8 years later, he fulfilled not only Kennedy's promise, but also the dreams of Tsiolkovsky, Goddard, Oberth, and countless others. Their equations, experiments, and visions had converged into reality. The dream of spaceflight was never simple, never purely scientific, and never free of struggle. It was shaped by myth and mathematics, by fiction and fact, by war and wonder. It was the accumulation of centuries of human longing, crystallized in the 20th century when rockets finally pierced the sky. Before the space race became a contest of nations, it was a dream of humanity itself. A dream that one day we would no longer look up at the stars as distant, untouchable lights, but as destinations. On the morning of April 12, 1961, the world awoke to a moment that would forever alter human history. In the Soviet Union, on a remote steppe at the Baikonur Cosmodrome, preparations were underway for a mission unlike any attempted before. Young pilot, just 27 years old, climbed into a small spherical capsule perched atop a powerful rocket. His name was Yuri Gagarin, and within hours he would become the first human being to leave Earth behind, to rise above the atmosphere, and to circle the planet in orbit. His flight lasted just 108 minutes, but in that brief span of time he not only fulfilled the dreams of scientists and visionaries, but also captured the imagination of all humanity. Gagarin's orbit was not just a triumph of engineering. It was a triumph of spirit, of courage, and of the human longing to break free from the boundaries of Earth. The story of Gagarin's historic orbit begins long before that morning. Born in 1934 in a small village west of Moscow, Gagarin grew up in a modest family. His childhood was marked by hardship. During the Second World War, his village was occupied by German troops, and the family lived through years of deprivation. Yet even in these difficult circumstances, Gagarin showed curiosity and resilience. As he grew older, he trained as a foundry worker, then pursued aviation, enrolling in flight school. His natural ability in the cockpit, combined with his cheerful personality and calm under pressure, soon brought him to the attention of Soviet authorities. When the Soviet Union began selecting candidates for a new secretive program to train cosmonauts, Gagarin was among those chosen. The selection process was grueling. Dozens of pilots were tested for physical endurance, psychological stability, and adaptability under extreme stress. The demands of space were unlike any faced by ordinary aviators. Isolation, weightlessness, the confinement of tiny capsules, and the risk of catastrophic failure. Gagarin stood out not only for his skill, but for his demeanor. He was small in stature, which suited the cramped confines of the spacecraft, but he possessed a warm smile and a steady temperament that inspired confidence. To his trainers and fellow cosmonauts, he seemed born for the role. When the time came to choose who would make the first flight, Gagarin was selected. It was a decision that would make his name immortal. The spacecraft he would ride, called Vostok 1, was little more than a metal sphere coated in ablative material to withstand the searing heat of re-entry. Inside it was cramped, with barely enough room for Gagarin to move. He would be strapped into a chair, surrounded by dials and switches, but much of the flight would be controlled automatically. Atop the capsule stood the R-7 rocket, a descendant of intercontinental ballistic missiles, modified to carry humans instead of warheads. The engineering challenges were immense. The rocket had to accelerate fast enough to reach orbit. The capsule had to protect its occupant from the vacuum of space, and the re-entry system had to bring him safely back through the atmosphere. Every stage was fraught with danger, and no one could be certain it would work out as dawn broke on April 12th. Gagarin donned his orange flight suit and white helmet, marked simply with the letters CCCP. He smiled for cameras and waved to technicians. Though the moment was heavy with risk, he was about to attempt something no human had ever done, something that could end in glory or in tragedy. At 9:07 a.m. Moscow time, the engines of the R-7 roared to life, shaking the steppe as fire and smoke engulfed the launch pad. Slowly, then with gathering force, the rocket lifted from the Earth, carrying Gagarin skyward. As he ascended, his voice crackled over the radio. "Poyakali, let's go." The words became legendary, the unofficial motto of humanity's entry into space. Within minutes, Gagarin's capsule had reached orbit. For the first time, a human being looked down upon Earth from the outside. What he saw was breathtaking. The curvature of the planet, the thin blue line of the atmosphere, the vast oceans and continents unfolding beneath him. Gagarin described the view with awe, noting the beauty of the Earth from above. His voice carried calm wonder, not fear. To those listening on the ground, his reports brought reassurance that humanity could indeed survive in the harsh environment beyond the sky. The flight itself was brief but momentous. Gagarin completed a single orbit, circling the globe in just under 2 hours. During that time, he experienced weightlessness, his body floating inside the capsule. He communicated with ground control, his voice steady and composed. The world below followed with rapt attention, though in the West news was scarce at first. When Soviet radio finally broadcast the announcement, the impact was immediate and profound. The Soviet Union had achieved a triumph beyond imagination. They had sent a man into space and returned him safely to Earth. Re-entry was perhaps the most dangerous part of the mission. As the capsule plunged back into the atmosphere, it was subjected to extreme heat and stress. Flames surrounded the craft, and for several minutes communication was lost. Then, at last, parachutes deployed, and Gagarin descended safely, landing in a field near the Volga River. A farmer and her daughter, startled by the sight of a man in a bright orange suit emerging from the sky, approached cautiously. Gagarin reassured them with a smile, explaining that he was a Soviet cosmonaut returning from space. The journey was complete, and history had been made. The impact of Gagarin's flight was immediate and worldwide. In the Soviet Union, he was hailed as a hero, paraded through Moscow in triumph, his face plastered on posters and stamps. To the world, he became a symbol of courage and progress, his smile representing the possibility of human achievement. For the United States, his flight was a shock, a reminder that the Soviet Union was ahead in the space race. Just weeks later, President John F. Kennedy would issue his famous challenge to land a man on the moon. But for the moment, it was Gagarin's orbit that defined the era. Gagarin himself remained humble. Despite fame that could have overwhelmed anyone, he retained his warmth and simplicity. He continued to work within the Soviet space program, though he would never fly in space again. His role became symbolic, a reminder of the first step humanity had taken beyond its cradle. Tragically, his life was cut short in 1968 when he died in a training accident. But by then, his legacy was secure. His single orbit had changed history. What makes Gagarin's flight so remarkable is not only its technical achievement, but its symbolic power. In just 108 minutes, he proved that humans could survive in space, could endure weightlessness, could return safely from orbit. More than that, he showed that space was not the realm of fiction, but of reality. The heavens had been touched, and the path was open. Gagarin's smile, his courage, his simple declaration of "let's go," captured the essence of humanity's leap into the cosmos. From that day forward, the space race was no longer a dream. It was a reality unfolding before the eyes of the world. Gagarin's orbit was the first great milestone, the proof of concept, the spark that ignited the race to the moon. Without his courage, without that flight, Neil Armstrong's step might never have followed. Gagarin carried with him not only the pride of a nation, but the hopes of a species. Encircling the Earth, he united us all in wonder, reminding humanity that our future lay not only on the ground beneath our feet, but in the stars above. When Yuri Gagarin landed safely on April 12, 1961, the world seemed to pause. The news spread like wildfire. A man had circled the Earth, and he had come back alive. For the Soviet Union, it was a triumph so profound that it resonated far beyond the borders of ideology or politics. For the United States, it was a shockwave, a moment of humiliation, and at the same time, a catalyst. In just one orbit, the Soviet Union had taken the lead not only in the space race, but in the global imagination. The balance of prestige shifted overnight, and from that day forward, the contest between superpowers would accelerate with new urgency. The Soviet triumph was celebrated with unparalleled fervor at home. Gagarin, a modest pilot from a small village, was transformed instantly into a hero of the people. His smiling face was printed on posters, stamps, and banners. Crowds filled the streets of Moscow to greet him, showering him with flowers, waving flags, and chanting his name. He stood alongside Premier Nikita Khrushchev in Red Square, his presence symbolizing the might and brilliance of Soviet science. The official narrative was clear. Socialism had carried humanity into space before capitalism could even catch its breath. To the Soviet people, weary from years of post-war struggle, the achievement was a moment of pride, proof that their sacrifices had not been in vain. The symbolism of Gagarin's flight extended beyond Soviet borders. Around the world, newspapers carried his image, describing him as a pioneer for all mankind. Even in countries aligned with the United States, admiration for the feat was evident. Humanity had dreamed of space for centuries, and now one of their own had touched it. Yet the politics would not be ignored. In the halls of Washington, the shock was profound. America, which prided itself on technological innovation, found itself behind. Just months earlier, the United States had sent its first astronaut, Alan Shepard, into training for a suborbital flight. But Shepard had not yet launched. The Soviet Union had leapt ahead, leaving America to explain why it had been beaten to the most historic milestone of all. The American public reacted with a mixture of awe, fear, and frustration. Many citizens admired Gagarin's courage, but worried about the implications. If the Soviets could put a man in orbit, what else could their rockets do? If they could carry a capsule into space, they could surely carry nuclear warheads farther and faster than before. The space race was not just about prestige, it was about survival. The same rockets that carried Gagarin around the Earth were born from missiles designed for war. Thus, the triumph of one man's orbit cast a long shadow over the balance of power. President John F. Kennedy, just months into his presidency, faced the challenge head-on. He recognized the symbolic weight of the Soviet victory and the necessity of responding with bold action. Within weeks, he addressed Congress, declaring that the United States would commit to a goal unprecedented in scope and ambition: to land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the decade was out. Kennedy's words asterisk, "We choose to go to the moon," asterisk, were not only a promise but a challenge, a vow that America would not remain in second place. It was a gamble, for the technology did not yet exist, but it was also a declaration of intent. The moon would become the new battlefield of prestige. For the Soviets, the triumph of Gagarin was both exhilarating and demanding. Sergei Korolev, the chief designer of the Soviet space program, knew that maintaining momentum would be difficult. Resources were limited and secrecy was absolute. Successes were celebrated publicly, but failures were hidden in silence. Still, the achievements continued. Just months after Gagarin, cosmonaut German Titov completed a full day in orbit, further demonstrating Soviet dominance. In 1963, Valentina Tereshkova became the first woman in space, another symbolic victory that underscored Soviet claims of progress and equality. Yet triumph carried its own pressures. Khrushchev used space achievements as tools of propaganda, demanding ever greater feats to prove the superiority of the Soviet system. Korolev and his engineers were driven to attempt missions that pushed the limits of their technology. Though victories came, the strain grew heavier. Behind the scenes, not every launch succeeded. Rockets exploded, test flights failed, and lives were lost in silence. But for the outside world, the image remained one of relentless progress. In the United States, shock gradually gave way to determination. NASA accelerated its Mercury program, determined to put Americans into orbit. Alan Shepard's suborbital flight in May 1961, just weeks after Gagarin, was a success, but it was modest compared to the Soviet feat. Later that year, John Glenn became the first American to orbit Earth, restoring some pride and demonstrating that the United States was catching up. Yet the gap remained. The Soviets had been first, and that fact could never be erased. The shock of Gagarin's orbit also reshaped education and culture in America. Schools emphasized science and mathematics, urging children to prepare for futures in engineering and research. Funding for universities increased, and research into rocketry, physics, and technology expanded rapidly. The government recognized that the space race was not just about rockets. It was about building a generation capable of sustaining innovation. From classrooms to laboratories, the shock of being second ignited a nationwide effort to leap ahead. Globally, the triumph. Gagarin and the shock of America created a strange duality. On one hand, space became a stage for rivalry, each superpower seeking to outshine the other. On the other, space became a source of shared wonder. People around the world looked up at the night sky with new eyes, knowing that one of their own had circled above. Science fiction seemed closer than ever, and children in every nation dreamed of becoming astronauts or cosmonauts. Even as the Cold War hardened divisions, spaceflight hinted at a future that might unite rather than divide. For the Soviets, Gagarin's flight was immortalized as a triumph of socialism. For Americans, it was the spark that set them on the path to the moon. For humanity, it was the first undeniable proof that we belonged not only on Earth but beyond it. The shock and triumph of 1961 reverberated across the decade, shaping decisions, inspiring missions, and setting the stage for Armstrong's step. It is easy, in retrospect, to see the space race as destined, as though the moon landing was inevitable. But in those early years, nothing was certain. America reeled from defeat, the Soviets basked in glory, and the outcome remained in doubt. What was clear, however, was that space had become the new frontier of history. The triumph of Gagarin and the shock of America ensured that the race would continue faster and higher until one nation planted a flag on the lunar surface. The spring of 1961 was a moment of reckoning for the United States. The Soviet Union had just stunned the world with Yuri Gagarin's flight, and America, a nation that prided itself on technological prowess, found itself in second place. The newspapers, the politicians, and the public all asked the same question. How had America, with its wealth and resources, fallen behind? For President John F. Kennedy, new to office and still defining his leadership, the shock of Gagarin's orbit became both a political challenge and an opportunity. Out of that moment came one of the boldest promises ever made by a statesman, the commitment that before the decade was out, the United States would land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth. It was a vow that seemed almost impossible. Yet it became the driving force of the American space program and set the course of history. Kennedy's promise was not born in isolation. The early months of his presidency were turbulent. In April 1961, just days after Gagarin's triumph, the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba ended in disaster, embarrassing the young administration. At the same time, the Cold War loomed large, with tensions rising in Berlin and fears of nuclear confrontation spreading across the globe. To many, America seemed vulnerable, its leadership questioned both at home and abroad. Kennedy understood that he needed a bold vision to restore confidence, to demonstrate that the United States could still lead the world. The space program, once seen as a scientific endeavor, became the perfect stage for this drama of prestige. Behind the scenes, Kennedy sought advice. He asked his science advisors and NASA officials a direct question: was there any goal in space that America could achieve before the Soviets? The answer was sobering. In satellite launches and human spaceflight and orbital achievements, the Soviets were ahead. But there was one possibility, one challenge so difficult that neither side had yet attempted it: a manned landing on the moon. It would require new rockets, new spacecraft, new technologies, and immense resources. Yet if America committed fully, it might be achieved before the decade's end. Kennedy weighed the risks. It was costly, it was uncertain, but it was also grand. To stand on the moon would be to claim not only victory in the space race, but a place in history unmatched by any rival. On May 25, 1961, Kennedy addressed a joint session of Congress. His words carried the clarity of determination. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth. The chamber erupted in applause, but beyond the political theater, the weight of the promise was immense. America had less than 9 years to accomplish something no human had ever attempted. It was not simply a pledge of ambition, it was a test of national will. The boldness of Kennedy's promise lay in its specificity. Politicians often speak in vague aspirations, but Kennedy gave a concrete deadline and a clear goal. The moon was not symbolic, it was literal. The timeline was not distant, it was urgent. And the task was not easy, it was monumental. By making such a precise commitment, Kennedy forced America to act. NASA would have to expand rapidly. Engineers would have to innovate beyond known limits. And billions of dollars would have to be invested. It was a gamble on the future, and it demanded faith from the American people. The reaction was mixed. Many citizens were inspired, thrilled by the vision of reaching the moon. Others questioned the cost, especially at a time when poverty, civil rights struggles, and other social issues demanded attention. Critics argued that the money could be better spent on Earth than on the heavens. Yet the momentum of Kennedy's words carried the day. Congress approved the funding, and NASA began the monumental task of turning the dream into reality. For the tube and NASA began the monumental task of turning the dream into reality. Soviets, Kennedy's promise was both a challenge and a complication. They had claimed victory with Gagarin, but now the United States had raised the stakes. The moon was no longer a distant object in the night sky. It was the finish line of a global race. Soviet leaders debated their response. Khrushchev recognized the prestige at stake, but resources were stretched, and internal struggles plagued their program. Still, they began planning their own lunar efforts, determined not to be left behind. The space race, already intense, now had a clear destination. Kennedy's promise also transformed NASA. Once a relatively modest agency focused on research and development, NASA became the centerpiece of America's technological ambition. New centers were built from Houston to Cape Canaveral. Entire industries were mobilized, and tens of thousands of scientists, engineers, and workers joined the effort. Programs like Mercury and Gemini became stepping stones, testing the skills and technologies needed for Apollo. The challenge of the moon landing required not only rockets, but navigation, communication, life support, and re-entry systems, each one a field of innovation. Kennedy's words had lit a fire that spread through laboratories, factories, and classrooms across the nation. For Kennedy himself, the promise became part of his legacy. He spoke of it not only in Congress, but to the public, famously declaring, "At Rice University in 1962, we choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard." These words captured the spirit of the age. framing the moon landing not as a luxury, but as a test of courage and determination. The speech inspired millions, embedding the moon landing into the American imagination as a symbol of national purpose. Yet, Kennedy would not live to see his promise fulfilled. His assassination in 1963 shocked the world and left the nation in mourning. But the space program he had set in motion continued. His words became a guiding star for the nation, and the commitment to the moon became not only a political goal, but a tribute to his memory. Every launch, every test, every milestone in the Apollo program carried with it the weight of Kennedy's promise, a promise made bold by his vision and sanctified by his laws. Looking back, Kennedy's bold promise stands as one of the most remarkable moments of leadership in modern history. It took a nation shaken by setbacks and gave it a goal so grand that it demanded unity, focus, and sacrifice. It challenged engineers to invent what had never been built, astronauts to risk what had never been risked, and citizens to support an endeavor beyond imagination. It set the stage for the Apollo program, for Armstrong's step, and for the ultimate triumph of the space race. In the spring of 1961, the United States was shocked, humbled, and uncertain. By the end of that decade, it would stand triumphant on the moon. The bridge between those two moments was Kennedy's promise, a bold declaration that transformed fear into ambition and competition into achievement. His words still echo, not only as history, but as inspiration, reminding humanity that great goals are worth pursuing, not because they are easy, but precisely because they are hard. If the dream of reaching space was grand, the reality of preparing human beings to go there was even more demanding. Rockets could be engineered, capsules could be designed, and trajectories could be calculated. But none of it mattered if the men chosen to ride those machines could not endure the ordeal. Space was an environment no human had ever entered before. Weightlessness, vacuum, radiation, isolation, and the ever-present risk of sudden death. To face such dangers required not only courage, but training so thorough and unforgiving that it would reshape the very bodies and minds of those selected. Both the Soviet Union and the United States understood that the men they chose as cosmonauts and astronauts had to be more than pilots. They had to become symbols, pioneers, and above all, survivors. In the Soviet Union, the training of cosmonauts was shrouded in secrecy. Sergei Korolev and his team of engineers built not only rockets, but entire regiments designed to test the limits of human endurance. From a pool of hundreds of candidates, young pilots from the Air Force were narrowed down to just a few dozen, chosen for their physical fitness, quick reflexes, and composure under stress. They had to be short because the cramped Vostok capsules allowed little room. They had to be resilient because the forces of launch and re-entry would punish the body in ways no ordinary flight could. Yuri Gagarin, German Titov, and their comrades underwent years of preparation that would challenge not only their muscles but their minds. Soviet training facilities were filled with machines that seemed like instruments of torture. Centrifuges spun candidates until they felt crushed under the weight of their own bodies, simulating the G-forces of launch and re-entry. Isolation chambers left them alone, in silence and darkness for hours, even days, testing whether their minds could withstand. Solitude without breaking. Tilt tables held them upside down, to study the effects of blood shifting through the body. Parabolic flights aboard aircraft gave them brief moments of weightlessness, their bodies floating and tumbling as they learned how to orient themselves without gravity. Every test was designed to mimic, in some small way, the unknown that awaited them in orbit. Psychological training was as vital as physical. Cosmonauts were taught to remain calm when alarms blared, when dials spun wildly, when simulated emergencies threatened their lives. They were drilled in manual controls, though the early spacecraft were mostly automated in case systems failed. They studied engineering, medicine, and survival skills, for landing zones were unpredictable, and a cosmonaut might find himself stranded in forests, swamps, or icy fields after returning to Earth. Gagarin himself trained in Siberia, learning how to survive with nothing but the contents of his capsule, practicing hunting, fishing, and building shelters. The cosmonaut was not simply an occupant of a spacecraft. He was the ultimate test subject, embodying the question of whether humans could adapt to a realm utterly alien. In the United States, training followed a similar yet distinct path. NASA's first astronauts, known as the Mercury 7, were chosen in 1959 from among military test pilots. Men like John Glenn, Alan Shepard, and Gus Grissom had already proven themselves in experimental aircraft, pushing machines to their limits at the edge of the atmosphere. Yet even they faced trials beyond anything they had known. At NASA's facilities, they were subjected to endless medical examinations, probing every organ, muscle, and reflex. Doctors studied their tolerance for heat, cold, pressure, and stress. They were spun in centrifuges, locked in sealed chambers, and strapped into vibrating machines that shook their bodies as if riding a rocket through turbulence. The aim was not only to test, but to measure, to gather data that would guide the design of spacecraft and missions. Like their Soviet counterparts, the American astronauts were trained for survival. If a capsule landed in the ocean, they had to know how to escape, how to inflate rafts, how to signal for rescue. If it landed on land, they had to manage injuries, find water, and endure until recovery teams arrived. NASA even sent them into deserts and jungles, forcing them to practice survival with limited supplies. Beyond the physical, they trained in simulators that reproduced the cockpit of their spacecraft, rehearsing every possible scenario, every failure, every contingency. They practiced launches, orbits, and re-entries until the motions became second nature. The Americans also faced the burden of public scrutiny. While Soviet cosmonauts trained in secret, hidden from the world until success was assured, NASA's astronauts were celebrities before they ever flew. Their names were published, their families interviewed, their photographs splashed across magazines. They were expected to embody not only courage but virtue, to be models of American manhood, patriotism, and decency. The pressure was immense. A mistake in training could be splashed across headlines. A failure in flight could be broadcast live on television. The astronauts bore the hopes of a nation, and their training prepared them not only for space, but for the stage of history. The training programs on both sides reflected the values of their nations. The Soviets emphasized discipline, secrecy, and obedience. Cosmonauts were soldiers first, symbols of the state whose personal stories were subordinate to the collective triumph. The Americans emphasized individuality, public relations, and technical mastery. Astronauts were heroes as much as pilots, their personalities carefully cultivated for the public eye. Yet in both cases, the core was the same: to prepare human beings for the most hostile environment imaginable, to ensure they could endure the unendurable. The physical toll of training was heavy. Men staggered out of centrifuges, drenched in sweat, their vision blurred from the crushing force. They emerged from isolation chambers, shaken, their sense of time distorted. They vomited in aircraft during weightless flights, struggled with nausea, disorientation, and exhaustion. But these trials forged resilience. By the time they climbed into capsules, they had already endured simulations of terror, teaching them to trust their training when machines failed or danger loomed. The psychological toll was equally severe. Many astronauts and cosmonauts spoke of the loneliness, the endless repetition, the sense that their lives were consumed by preparation with little certainty of reward. Yet they pressed on, driven by a mix of patriotism, ambition, and the awareness that they stood at the edge of history. The possibility of death was ever present, but so was the allure of being first, of leaving footprints where none had ever been dot. By the early 1960s, both programs had produced men ready to fly. In the Soviet Union, Gagarin's training gave him that calm confidence to orbit Earth with composure. In the United States, Shepard, Glenn, and their comrades prepared to follow, eager to prove that America could match and surpass its rival. Behind each flight lay years of training, invisible to the public, years of sacrifice that transformed ordinary pilots into explorers of the cosmos. In truth, the training of cosmonauts and astronauts was more than preparation. It was part of the experiment. Humanity did not know how bodies would react to weightlessness, how minds would endure isolation, how hearts would bear the strain of launch. Every test, every exercise was a step into the unknown. These men were both pioneers and subjects, carrying with them not only national pride, but the hopes of all humanity. Their training was not glamorous, often grueling, sometimes humiliating, but it was essential. Without it, there could be no Gagarin, no Glenn, no Armstrong. Without it, the dream of space would have remained a dream dot in the quiet hours of centrifuges, in the solitude of chambers, and the endless repetition of simulators. The foundations of spaceflight were built. The training shaped not only the bodies of astronauts and cosmonauts, but their character, forging resilience from exhaustion, courage from fear. And when they finally climbed into rockets, strapped into capsules smaller than cars, facing the vastness of the unknown, they carried with them the confidence that they had endured every trial Earth could offer. Beyond that point, only the heavens remained to test them. When we think of the space race, we often picture the men and women who risked their lives, or the presidents and premiers who issued bold declarations. Yet behind the triumphs and tragedies stood the machines themselves, the spacecraft that carried human beings from the surface of Earth into the emptiness beyond. These capsules, designed with a mixture of brilliance, caution, and urgency, were not elegant. They were cramped, dangerous, and often experimental, but they were the vessels of humanity's greatest leap. They carried not only flesh and bone, but also the dreams of nations, the pride of peoples, and the hopes of an entire species. Without the spacecraft, there could be no orbit, no step, no moon landing. They were, in every sense, the fragile bridges between Earth and the heavens. The first of these was the Soviet Vostok. When Yuri Gagarin climbed into his capsule in 1961, he entered a sphere less than 8 feet in diameter, its walls lined with instruments, dials, and life support equipment. It had no graceful design, no comforts, and no room to move. Gagarin could barely shift in his seat, strapped tightly into the machine that would hurl him into orbit. The controls were mostly automated, for Korolev and his engineers did not fully trust a human to operate such a complex flight. In the event of system failure, a sealed envelope contained the code that would allow Gagarin to override the automation, but otherwise he was more passenger than pilot. The Vostok had a small porthole, just enough for him to glimpse the Earth below, but it was no grand window on the universe. It was, in truth, a survival chamber designed to keep its occupant alive in conditions no human had ever faced. Its simplicity was its strength, and though it was primitive by later standards, it succeeded. Gagarin orbited Earth and returned alive, proving that humans could ride machines into space. The Vostok series carried more than Gagarin. Cosmonauts like German, Titov, Andrian, Nikolaev, and Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space, all flew aboard versions of the capsule. Each mission pushed the limits further. Longer flights, multiple orbits, more complex maneuvers. But the core remained the same: a small sphere, a heat shield, and parachutes to return the cosmonaut to Earth. Landing was not gentle. In fact, cosmonauts were ejected from their capsules at high altitude and descended separately by parachute, because the Vostok itself could not land safely with its occupant inside. It was a brutal design, but effective. The Vostok carried the Soviet Union to its greatest victories in the early space race and demonstrated that space was not the realm of fiction, but of reality. Across the ocean, the United States pursued its own path with Project Mercury. The Mercury capsules, first launched in 1961, were slightly larger than the Vostok, but no more spacious. Astronauts compared them to sitting inside a telephone booth strapped to a rocket. Unlike the Soviets, the Americans emphasized the role of the pilot. The Mercury capsules were equipped with manual controls, allowing astronauts like John Glenn, Alan Shepard, and Gus Grissom to adjust their flight paths, orient their spacecraft, and test the limits of maneuvering in orbit. The Mercury missions proved that Americans could not only reach space, but also operate within it, laying the groundwork for more ambitious goals. The Mercury capsule had a blunt, conical shape designed to endure the fiery heat of re-entry. It carried its occupant back to Earth intact, splashing down in the ocean where Navy ships awaited recovery. This method contrasted with the Soviet approach of ejecting cosmonauts, and it reflected NASA's emphasis on safety and precision. Yet the Mercury missions were still dangerous. Heat shields threatened to fail, parachutes tangled, and rockets sometimes malfunctioned. Each successful flight was a victory, but each one carried the knowledge that failure could mean death. Still, with every orbit, the Mercury program closed the gap with the Soviets, proving that America could rise to the challenge. As the race intensified, both nations advanced to new spacecraft. For the Soviets, the Voskhod program expanded on Vostok, modifying the design to carry multiple cosmonauts. In 1964, Voskhod 1 carried 3 men into space, the first multi-crew flight in history. The achievement was hailed as another Soviet triumph, but it came with risks. To fit 3 men into the capsule, the engineers removed ejection seats, meaning that if anything went wrong during launch, the crew would have no escape. It was a gamble, but it succeeded. Voskhod 2 in 1965 carried Alexei Lenov, who performed the first spacewalk, stepping outside his capsule into the void. His suit ballooned dangerously, nearly trapping him outside, and his re-entry was fraught with peril, but he survived. These missions pushed boundaries, but they also revealed the limits of Soviet designs. Voskhod was a stopgap, a way to claim firsts, but it was not sustainable for longer missions. In America, the Gemini program succeeded Mercury, and it was here that NASA prepared in earnest for the moon. Gemini capsules were larger, capable of carrying 2 astronauts, and equipped for longer missions. They tested rendezvous and docking, essential skills for lunar missions where modules would need to connect in orbit. Gemini astronauts practiced spacewalks, learned to maneuver with precision, and pushed the limits of endurance with flights lasting more than a week. Every Gemini mission was a rehearsal for Apollo. The spacecraft itself was a marvel of engineering, more advanced than Mercury, but still rugged, still dangerous. Astronauts described the Gemini as a true spacecraft, something that could be piloted rather than merely ridden. By the end of the program, America had mastered the techniques required to reach the moon, all within the cramped metal shells of Gemini. For the Soviets, the Soyuz program began to take shape in the mid-1960s. Unlike Vostok and Voskhod, Soyuz was designed for complexity and versatility. It consisted of 3 modules: an orbital module, a descent module, and a service module. The design allowed greater comfort, longer missions, and more advanced operations. Though its early flights were marred by tragedy, cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov died in 1967 when his Soyuz 1 malfunctioned. The program eventually became the backbone of Soviet space exploration. Remarkably, Soyuz remains in use today, its design refined but fundamentally unchanged, a testament to its resilience. And then there was Apollo. The American Apollo spacecraft, designed to carry 3 astronauts to the moon, represented the culmination of NASA's efforts. Larger, more spacious, and far more capable than Mercury or Gemini, Apollo was both a command ship and a home in space. Its command module carried the crew, while its service module housed the engines and life support systems. For lunar missions, it was paired with a lunar module, a spidery lander designed to descend to the surface of the moon. Apollo was a machine, built not just for orbit, but for history. Every switch, every circuit, every system was designed to take human beings farther than they had ever gone. The Apollo missions demanded rockets of unprecedented power. The Saturn V, a towering giant, was created to lift the Apollo spacecraft beyond Earth's orbit. Standing taller than the Statue of Liberty, it generated thrust equivalent to millions of horsepower. Its roar shook the ground for miles, and its ascent carried the dreams of a nation. Inside the Apollo command module, astronauts sat strapped in, surrounded by hundreds of switches and displays, their fate tied to a rocket of unimaginable power. The spacecraft itself was the product of thousands of engineers, each solving problems that had never before been faced. Though these spacecraft were marvels of engineering, they were also fragile. They offered thin walls of protection against the vacuum, shields against heat, and systems that could fail at any moment. Astronauts and cosmonauts lived inside them as inside coffins of technology, trusting their lives to machines that had been tested but never proven until flight. The courage required to enter them cannot be overstated. They were not graceful ships, but capsules of survival, each one carrying men into realms no human had endured. What unites all these machines, Vostok, Mercury, Voskhod, Gemini, Soyuz, and Apollo, is that they carried more than just crews. They carried the ambition of nations and the dream of humanity. Each rivet, each wire, each seal bore the weight of history. The astronauts and cosmonauts who rode them became symbols, but the spacecraft themselves were the vessels of those symbols. Fragile, imperfect, yet mighty in purpose. They were not only machines, they were monuments of courage, disguised as metal shells dot when Armstrong finally stepped onto the moon in 1969. It was the Apollo spacecraft that had carried him there. When Gagarin smiled from orbit in 1961, it was Vostok that held him safe. Each spacecraft was a dream made tangible, proof that imagination could be shaped into steel and that steel could carry men into the heavens. The story of spaceflight is not only the story of people but of machines, for without them the dream would have remained forever earthbound. The story of the space race is often told as a triumph, a tale of bold achievements and glittering milestones. Gagarin's smile from orbit, Glenn's calm voice circling Earth, Armstrong's footprint on the moon. Yet behind every triumph lay shadow. For every successful launch, there were failures. For every astronaut celebrated, there were lives lost. The path to the stars was not straight, nor was it safe. Rockets exploded, capsules failed, and men died in the pursuit of dreams. To understand the true cost of the space race, one must remember not only the victories, but the disasters and the setbacks that shaped them. The earliest years of rocketry were fraught with danger. Both the Soviet Union and the United States struggled to master machines that were, by nature, unstable. Rockets filled with volatile fuel were prone to catastrophic failure. On launch pads, they sometimes erupted in fire, sending metal and flame into the sky before crashing back in ruin. Engineers worked tirelessly, but even small errors could lead to disaster. In those days, every test was a gamble, every launch a question mark. Spectacular failures were not exceptions, they were part of the process. Yet with each failure, lessons were learned, systems improved, and designs refined. For the Soviet Union, tragedy struck in 1960 at the Baikonur Cosmodrome. Known as the Netherland catastrophe, it occurred during preparations for a massive rocket test. Impatient for results, officials ordered technicians to continue working even as the rocket sat fully fueled. A spark ignited the fuel, and in an instant, the launch pad became an inferno. More than 100 people were killed, burned in the blast, or trapped in the flames. The disaster was kept secret for decades, hidden by Soviet authorities who feared the embarrassment. But for those who survived, the memory lingered. The pursuit of progress carried a terrible cost. Another Soviet tragedy came in 1967 with the flight of Soyuz-1. Cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov was chosen to test the new spacecraft. Despite engineers' warning of unresolved flaws, From the start, the mission went wrong. Solar panels failed to deploy, leaving the capsule underpowered. Control systems malfunctioned, instruments gave false readings, and Komarov struggled to stabilize the ship. He fought bravely, improvising solutions, but when re-entry came, the parachutes failed. His capsule plunged to Earth and smashed into the ground, killing him instantly. Komarov became the first man to die on a space mission, and his death shook the Soviet program deeply. Engineers wept and fellow cosmonauts mourned. Yet the program continued, for the race could not stop. The United States faced its own tragedies. In January 1967, Apollo 1 was scheduled for a routine ground test. Astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee climbed into their spacecraft, sealed in their suits, preparing for a countdown rehearsal. The cabin was pressurized with pure oxygen, a decision meant to simplify systems, but one that made the environment dangerously flammable. A spark, perhaps, from a frayed wire ignited the atmosphere, and within seconds the capsule was an inferno. The astronauts struggled to open the hatch, but it was sealed shut, designed to open outward under pressure. Ground crews fought desperately to reach them, but by the time the flames subsided, all 3 men were dead. The accident shocked the nation. America had dreamed of the moon, but in an instant it was confronted with the fragility of human life. In the face of fire, the aftermath of Apollo 1 was both sorrow and determination. Investigations revealed flaws in design, safety oversights, and the dangers of rushing under political pressure. NASA overhauled its systems, redesigning the Apollo capsule, changing materials, and improving procedures. The tragedy forced engineers and officials to face the reality that success could not come without caution. The deaths of Grissom, White, and Chaffee were honored not only in memory but in action. Their sacrifice made the path to the moon safer for those who followed. Yet the shadow of their loss lingered over every Apollo flight. Even missions that ended in survival often revealed the razor's edge between triumph and disaster. In 1965, Alexei Leonov stepped outside his Voskhod 2 capsule to perform the first spacewalk. The world celebrated, but what the public did not know was that his suit ballooned in the vacuum, making it impossible for him to re-enter the capsule. He struggled, forcing air out of his suit at risk of suffocation, barely squeezing. Back inside, later the capsule's re-entry went off course, landing in a snowy forest where he and his crewmate waited for hours, surrounded by wolves and cold, until rescue teams arrived. It was a success, but one that carried the scent of failure. In 1966, Gemini 8 demonstrated the same precarious balance. Astronauts Neil Armstrong and David Scott performed a successful docking in orbit, the first of its kind. Yet soon after, a thruster malfunctioned, sending their spacecraft spinning violently, endangering their lives. Armstrong remained calm, shutting down the faulty system and regaining control, but the mission had to be cut short. It was a reminder that even the most skilled pilots were vulnerable to mechanical flaws. Every mission was a test, and every test carried risks. These disasters and setbacks had a paradoxical effect. They revealed the dangers, the limits, the costs of pushing too far, too fast. Yet they also reinforced the determination to continue. Each tragedy sparked redesigns, each failure brought lessons, and each near disaster strengthened the resolve of those who followed. For the engineers, it was a process of relentless improvement. For the astronauts and cosmonauts, it was a matter of courage knowing the risks, seeing the funerals of their comrades, yet still climbing into rockets with trust in the machines and in their training. The world, watching from afar, saw the triumphs, but rarely the failures. Soviet disasters were hidden from public view, revealed only years later. American setbacks were broadcast live, their flames and explosions visible on television screens. In both nations, the pursuit of victory carried human costs, but those costs were borne with stoic silence. To admit failure was painful, but to stop was unthinkable. The race to the moon demanded perseverance, no matter the price. Looking back, the disasters and setbacks of the space race remind us that progress is never free. Behind every successful orbit, every landing, every celebrated step, there were lives lost, machines destroyed, and lessons paid for in blood and fire. Yet without those sacrifices, the dream could not have been achieved. Gagarin's triumph, Glenn's orbits, Armstrong's footprint, all were built upon the failures that came before. The disasters were not the end of the story, but part of it, shaping the path, reminding humanity of both its fragility and its resilience. The space race was not only a story of glory, it was also a story of grief. But in the balance of triumph and tragedy, humanity chose to continue, to risk again, and to reach higher. The setbacks did not stop the dream. They made the dream more costly, more solemn, but also more meaningful. By the late 1960s, the space race had reached its decisive moment. The Soviet Union had claimed the earliest victories: the first satellite, the first man in orbit, the first woman, the first spacewalk. But after the death of Vladimir Komarov and Soyuz 1 and a series of technical struggles, the Soviet program began to falter. In contrast, the United States, galvanized by Kennedy's bold promise and tempered by the tragedy of Apollo 1, pressed forward with determination. Each mission of Apollo built upon the last, rehearsing, refining, and preparing for the ultimate goal, landing a man on the moon. The world held its breath as 1969 approached, waiting to see if America could achieve what once seemed impossible. At the heart of that effort stood a quiet, steady man. Neil Armstrong. Armstrong was not the most flamboyant of astronauts, nor the most outspoken. He was a test pilot by training, reserved, modest, almost shy. Yet his calm under pressure was legendary. In 1966, during the Gemini 8 mission, he had faced disaster when a thruster malfunction sent his spacecraft tumbling uncontrollably. With precision and composure, Armstrong shut down the systems and regained control, saving his life and his crewmates. This steady hand, this ability to remain calm in crisis, marked him as the ideal commander for Apollo 11. The moon demanded not only skill, but poise, and Armstrong embodied both. Alongside him would fly Edwin "Buzz" Aldrin, a brilliant engineer and determined pilot, and Michael Collins, who would remain in lunar orbit as his crewmates descended. Together, they would carry the weight of a nation's promise and humanity's dream. Apollo 11 was not the first test of lunar capability. The missions that came before it paved the way. Apollo 7 tested the redesigned spacecraft after the Apollo 1 tragedy. Apollo 8 circled the moon, giving humanity its first glimpse of Earth rising above the lunar horizon, a vision that inspired awe and humility. Apollo 9 tested the lunar module in Earth orbit, while Apollo 10 rehearsed the descent, coming within miles of the surface before returning home. Each mission built confidence, each one proving that the systems, the training, and the astronauts themselves were ready. By July 1969, all that remained was the final push. On July 16th, the Saturn V rocket stood on the pad at Cape Kennedy, a giant of steel and fire. Taller than a 35-story building, it was the most powerful machine ever built, its engines capable of producing thrust greater than the combined output of millions of horses. Atop it rested the Apollo 11 spacecraft, the Command Module Columbia, the Service Module, and the Lunar Module Eagle. Crowds gathered along the coast, filling beaches and roadsides to witness history. Millions more watched on television, there, eyes fixed on the white rocket gleaming in the Florida sun. At 9:32 a.m., the countdown reached 0, and the Saturn V roared to life. Flames and smoke billowed, the ground trembled, and slowly, impossibly, the giant rose into the sky. For the crew inside, the launch was a controlled fury. Strapped into their couches, they felt the crushing force of acceleration, their bodies pressed against their seats as the rocket carried them upward. Stage by stage, the Saturn V shed its engines, each one falling away as the next ignited, until at last Apollo 11 was free of Earth's grasp, coasting toward the moon. For 3 days, the spacecraft sailed through the void, a tiny island of life surrounded by infinite darkness. Collins monitored the systems. Aldrin checked calculations. Armstrong steered with precision. They were alone, 3 men in a capsule, carrying the hopes of billions. On July 19th, they entered lunar orbit. Beneath them stretched a desolate world, gray and cratered, its silence unbroken for billions of years. The moon had been humanity's companion since time immemorial, its phases guiding calendars, its light inspiring poets, its mystery haunting dreamers. Now, for the first time, humans orbited it, close enough to touch. The following day, Armstrong and Aldrin climbed into the lunar module Eagle, separating from Collins, who remained behind in Columbia. The descent began. Almost immediately, problems arose. A warning light flashed, program alarms indicating the computer was overloaded. In Houston, flight controllers debated furiously, but Guidance Officer Steve Bales gave the call to continue. The descent went on. As Eagle approached the surface, Armstrong peered through the window and saw that the designated landing site was strewn with boulders and a crater. Taking manual control, he guided the craft forward, searching for a safe spot. Fuel ran low. Alarms sounded, tension mounted. In Houston, controllers counted the seconds as reserves dwindled. At last, Armstrong found a flat patch of ground and set the module down. The call came, "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." Applause erupted in mission control, tears flowed, and relief swept the world. Humanity had arrived. Hours later, Armstrong prepared to step outside. The hatch opened, the ladder descended, and slowly he made his way down. Cameras transmitted the grainy images to millions watching on Earth. As his boot touched the lunar soil, he spoke the words that would echo forever. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." With that step, the ancient dream of touching the moon became reality. Aldrin soon followed, describing the surface as magnificent desolation. Together they planted the American flag, deployed experiments, and collected samples. There, time was short just over 2 hours on the surface, but its impact was eternal. Meanwhile, Collins orbited above, alone in Columbia. He later described the strange solitude, the sense of being the most isolated human in history, yet also the pride of knowing he was part of something greater than himself. When Armstrong and Aldrin returned, docking with Collins, the crew was whole again. Their mission had succeeded, and their journey home began. On July 24th, Apollo 11 splashed down in the Pacific Ocean. The astronauts were greeted as heroes, but they were also placed in quarantine to ensure no unknown lunar microbes threatened Earth. Crowds celebrated across the world, parades filled streets, leaders offered congratulations. For the United States, Kennedy's promise had been fulfilled. For the Soviet Union, the race was effectively over. For humanity, the moon had been touched, and nothing would ever be the same. Armstrong's calm composure, Aldrin's determination, Collins's quiet strength, all combined to make Apollo 11 the ultimate triumph of the space race. Yet it was not only their victory, it belonged to the thousands of engineers, scientists, and workers who built the machines, to the taxpayers who funded the effort, to the visionaries who dared to believe it was possible. Above all, it belonged to humanity, which had reached beyond Earth and found itself standing on another world. The final push to Apollo 11 was not smooth. It was paved with fire, failure, and loss, but it ended in triumph, a testament to what determination, courage, and vision can achieve. When Armstrong's foot pressed into lunar dust, it was not only America's step, but humanity's step, the culmination of centuries of dreaming and decades of rivalry. The space race had begun in fear and competition, but in that moment it ended in wonder. On the night of July 20th, 1969, the world seemed to hold its breath. In living rooms, classrooms, and town squares across the globe, people gathered around radios and flickering black and white televisions. The images were grainy, the sound at times distorted, but the meaning was unmistakable. Humanity was witnessing something that had never happened before. A man small and fragile against the backdrop of a vast, silent world was stepping onto the surface of the moon. For a brief moment, the divisions of nations, the rivalries of superpowers, and the boundaries of geography seemed to fade. For the first time, humanity shared a single, unifying triumph. When Neil Armstrong's boot pressed into lunar soil and his words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," echoed through the static, billions felt as though they too had taken that step. The Soviet Union had launched the first satellite and the first man, but now the United States had fulfilled Kennedy's promise and placed humans on another world. Yet beyond the politics there was a deeper resonance. This was not simply an American achievement or even a Soviet loss. It was proof that human beings, fragile creatures of flesh and bone, could reach across the void and stand on ground no foot had ever touched. The moment belonged to all dot in Moscow. Despite the rivalry, many ordinary citizens watched with awe. They knew their own cosmonauts had paved the way, but even so, Armstrong's step stirred admiration. In Paris and London, crowds spilled into the streets after midnight, cheering not only for America, but for humanity. In villages in Africa and towns in Asia, In islands across the Pacific, radios crackled with the news. For those few hours, humanity was united in wonder. Political divisions still existed, but they seemed smaller against the vastness of the cosmos. The astronauts themselves understood this. Buzz Aldrin described the lunar surface as magnificent desolation, a phrase that captured both its beauty and its loneliness. Michael Collins, circling above in Colombia, reflected later that while he missed walking on the moon, he never felt isolated. Instead, he looked at Earth small, fragile, blue and white against the black, and realized how united it appeared from space. No borders, no rivalries, no divisions. Just one planet, shared by all. His perspective echoed through generations, shaping the way people thought about themselves and their world. The symbolism of the Apollo 11 mission extended far beyond the moon itself. The astronauts planted an American flag, but beside it they also left a plaque. Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon. July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind. Those words were deliberate, meant to remind everyone that this was not conquest, but exploration. The moon had no armies, no borders, no history of war. It was a blank canvas, and the first words inscribed upon it were of peace. For a species so accustomed to conflict, this was a powerful statement. The impact of that single step rippled across society. Science and technology surged forward, fueled by the demands of the space program. Computers, once room-sized giants, became smaller and more efficient. Materials, engineering, and medicine all advanced. But perhaps more importantly, imagination itself was expanded. Children looked at the moon and saw not a distant light, but a place where people could walk. Writers, filmmakers, and dreamers built visions of futures among the stars. The leap from Earth to moon proved that the impossible could become possible. For the United States, the moon landing was a crowning achievement. It restored pride after years of shock at Soviet advances. It fulfilled Kennedy's promise, and it demonstrated the nation's capacity to rally behind a goal. For the Soviet Union, it was a reminder of what had been lost, but also a spur to continue. Their cosmonauts would not reach the moon, but they would pioneer space stations and long-duration flights, achievements that still shaped the future. The space race in its most intense form had ended, but space exploration itself had only just begun. What made Apollo 11 truly historic, however, was not only that it was accomplished, but that it was shared. In an age before the internet, before instant streaming, people across continents still watched together. They stayed awake through the night. They listened to static-filled radio. They peered at grainy screens, and they felt connected to something greater than themselves. For one night in July, the world looked up not with fear, not with rivalry, but with pride. Humanity had touched the stars, and it had done so in a way that belonged to everyone. The legacy of that moment endures. Decades later, people still recall where they were when they saw Armstrong take his step. Generations who had not yet been born still know the words, the images, the meaning. The footprints remain on the lunar surface, untouched by wind or rain, silent markers of a species that dared to reach beyond its home. They remind us that no matter how divided we may be, we share the same sky, the same planet, and the same capacity for wonder. In the years that followed, spaceflight would change. The Cold War rivalry softened. and cooperation slowly emerged. Americans and Soviets would one day shake hands in orbit, their spacecraft docked together as symbols of peace. Later still, nations from across the world would contribute to the International Space Station, a permanent home in orbit, built not by one country, but by many. All of these steps, all of this cooperation, was rooted in that first step on the moon, the moment when humanity learned that it could unite in awe rather than divide in fear. Looking back, the space race can be seen as both a competition and a collaboration. It was rivalry that drove the achievements, that pushed nations to spend resources and take risks. But it was shared humanity that gave those achievements meaning. Gagarin's orbit, Armstrong's step, these were not victories of one flag, but of one species. They showed what was possible when human beings dared to dream beyond the confines of their world. And so, the story that began with a divided Earth found its conclusion in a united moment. From the tense rivalries of the Cold War, from the disasters and setbacks, from the triumphs and sacrifices, humanity emerged with a new perspective. The moon had been touched, and in that touch, the world glimpsed itself not as a collection of nations, but as one. The space race began in division, but it ended, however briefly, in unity. Armstrong's step was not the final step exploration. Continues, but it was the first step taken together, watched by all, shared by all. It remains one of the rare moments in history when the entire planet was united, not by war or fear, but by wonder. For that reason, more than the technology, more than the politics, more than the rivalry, the legacy of Apollo 11 is simple. It showed humanity itself reflected in the dust of another world.